All right. We might consider the first three of Aquinas's five ways of proving that God exists versions of the cosmological argument, or that's the way it's often presented, including by our commentators in our book, 10 Essential Texts in the Philosophy of Religion. The cosmological argument, a cosmological argument, roughly, is an argument that appeals to the existence of a cosmos, that is, of a universe, of a world, maybe of some sort of ordered system, as some sort of ordered system. That's the traditional meaning of the word cosmos. So it's an a posteriori style of argument, but again, it appeals to the ultra minimal empirical facts, which I hope we can more or less agree on. That is, there is something rather than nothing. Okay, there is something. Because if there is anything, there's a universe. That is, if there is anything, there is everything that exists, whatever that is. Okay, so if you have a style of argument that basically appeals to that sheer fact of that there is something, or that there are, things, then you have a version of the cosmological argument, the most famous being, and this is, I think, the second, maybe best considered the second of Aquinas's five ways, the argument from first cause. Aristotle's argument that the universe has a creator in the sense of something that set it off. Now, in its first cause version and many other versions, this argument has really terrible problems. Okay, for one thing, like establishing that there cannot be an infinite chain of causation. Right? Why not? And if there cannot be an infinite chain of causation, okay, look, let's try this. If every event has a cause, if everything has a cause, then God has a cause. If God does not have a cause, then why do we think that everything must have a cause? Like, in other words, the internally to the argument, say the second way, look at your handout on this, for example, the premises contradict one another, right? Like everything has a cause, but guess what? This thing doesn't have a cause. Now, actually, Aquinas's versions of the cosmological argument are relatively subtle, actually, not quite that poor, and there are several. Okay, but they really do seem to face insuperable problems, actually. Okay, now, so Richard Taylor makes an attempt to kind of reconstruct a cosmological style of argument. It's not entirely original at all, actually. Well, I mean, but his version is nice and clear and crisp. Like, I think this Taylor putting forward a version, or sort of a newish version of the cosmological argument, reconstructing the cosmological argument, is an excellent little piece of philosophy. And so is Rowe's attack on it that follows, which we'll be discussing on Tuesday. Okay, all right. So one of the moves in Taylor's treatment is to move from a chain of causation, or of movers, to take the first Aquinas formulation, movers, things that make other things move, and getting you to a first mover, and instead thinking about a structure of explanation. What event, object explains what? Okay, moving from the order of cause to the order of explanation. Like, what explains, that it is raining or something? It's actually not. It's very sunny. What explains that? And one thing is that this takes it out of. that does not necessarily represent a temporal series, right? It's a conceptual series in some ways. Like, what do we appeal to if we wanted to try to figure out why this happened and not rather this? Do you see what I mean? So we move from the order of causes to the order of explanations. Now, but that's not an entire transformation, because, very often our explanation of some event is an account of the cause of that event, right? So it's not like we're moving outside the realm of cause entirely, but there could, in principle, also be other sorts of explanations. Taylor kind of explores this. Like, okay, so why am I alive? Well, like, my parents made me. That's the causal explanation or whatever. My parents, I don't want to think about that, I guess. But anyway, okay, why am I alive? Well, I need air. This is a Taylor kind of example. I need air. So one explanation is that, there is air in the atmosphere around me. There is food in the fridge, or, etc. And those things don't temporally precede me, but they're part of the explanation of why I am alive now, right? So it's an interesting transformation of the argument. In the Taylor formulation, which again I have on a handout, it's quite an elaborate argument, actually. I did it in terms of a 7-premise thing with several sub-conclusions marked by the tridot, the therefore. Okay, and I'm not going to go over it all, but I invite you to look at it and try to assess it, maybe with some of the stuff I talk about right now. Okay, the form of the argument is in terms of the principle of sufficient reason, the version of the argument. This version of the cosmological argument is formulated in terms of what's known as the principle of sufficient reason. It gets one of its clearest early formulations in Spinoza, and is associated with Leibniz, who did use it as an argument for the existence of God as well. He had a number of them. Okay. And this can be formulated in various ways. And with regard to various kinds of entities, like, you could think about this as a principle that is concerned with the existence of objects or substances, the existence of things. And in that case, it says that the existence of anything, with regard to the existence of anything that does exist, there has to be an explanation, a sufficient explanation, reasons that it does exist. Okay, or we could make it events. For every event that occurs, there must be an explanation of why it occurs. That appears to be for example, so that appears to be a fundamental presupposition of science, right? So, if you're thinking like you're Darwin, going like, why are the bodies of, mammals or whatever as they are? Well, one of the possibilities is not like there is no explanation. At that point, you've just forsworn science or whatever, or reason entirely. Okay, or maybe this is a very comprehensive way to put it. The second thing I have up there on the board behind me, I'll get all backwards. With regard to any fact, that is, anything that is actually the case. There are no false facts, okay? The way people are talking about facts and truth now is just like not competent to use the words, okay? There are no false facts or facts that do not obtain, right? A fact is what is the case. So with regard to anything that is the case, there is a reason or a set of reasons adequate to explain why it is the case and not otherwise. All right. So now, I mean, one thing that we might really ask is about the status of that principle. Like, what establishes that principle? Because obviously, this argument stands or falls. Well, it doesn't only stand or fall on the truth of that principle, but it definitely relies on it. I'm not sure how we could argue for it. Well, I mean, I guess the kind of argument I just gave is the kind of argument for it. Like, what, you know, but it also is a certain picture of the whole universe, right? And it's actually a kind of science positive picture of the whole universe. That is, in principle, anything could be explained, right? We don't have to stop anywhere. We shouldn't stop anywhere. I mean, it might get to be too big of an explanation, too complex of an explanation for us to grasp, or something like that. But we shouldn't give up because every fact is subject to explanation. Well, that's a kind of whole picture of the universe, actually. Uh, but it's also kind of a hopeful one, I guess. It's an anti-mystical one. Like we're not going to discover the thing we can't express or something. Like there's going to, or you know, we're not just going to enter into a realm where only faith is possible. We can in principle explain anything. I mean, we can, in principle, explain anything. Like maybe in more abstract sense, like there is, in principle, an explanation for anything. It might be something that we can't quite grasp. Maybe big data would help, though. Maybe our computer systems can grasp it. Anyway, whatever, and give us the conclusion. Help us to a conclusion. A universe that is open to explanation entirely. That's a nice, and it's not surprising that that principle comes to be like widely enunciated in the Enlightenment period, 17th and 18th centuries, Spinoza and Leibniz, for example. I'm sure Descartes would have subscribed to it if it had been clearly formulated. Maybe he did get to it. I don't know. Okay, so the first thing that Taylor does is he tries to motivate the principle of sufficient reason, try to get you to agree with it, while at the same time drawing a nice analogy to make his argument. So I'll just sort of, I guess I'm going to read a bit of this. This is on page 147 of our book in Richard Taylor's paper, The Cosmological Argument, a Defense and a Reformulation. Suppose you were strolling through the woods, and in addition to the sticks, stones, and other accustomed litter of the forest floor, you one day came upon some quite unaccustomed object, something not quite like what you had ever seen before, and would never expect to find in such a place. Suppose, for example, that it is a large ball about your own height, perfectly smooth and translucent. I don't know what it means to be perfectly translucent. That's a matter of degree, man. You would deem this puzzling and mysterious, certainly. Like, damn, what the fuck is that? So you came across a monolith out in the desert. But if one considers the matter, it is no more inherently mysterious that such a thing should exist than that anything else should exist. It is no more mysterious than that something like that should exist than that anything else should exist. Not without a little bit more context here, anyway. If you were quite accustomed to finding such objects of various sizes around you most of the time, but had never seen an ordinary rock, then upon finding a large rock in the woods one day, you would be just as puzzled and mystified. This illustrates the fact that something that is mysterious ceases to seem so simply by its accustomed presence. It is strange indeed. It is strange indeed, for example, that a world such as ours should exist. Yet few people are very often struck by this strangeness, but simply take it for granted. Suppose then that you have found this translucent ball and are mystified by it. Now, whatever else you might wonder about it, there is one thing you would hardly question, namely that it did not appear there all by itself, that it owes its existence to something. I mean, I think you would. Like, why is this here? How did this get here? that's exactly what people asked when they found that monolith in the desert and so on. Like, okay, one of the possibilities is that one of the possibilities is definitely not that there is no explanation. Okay, maybe it's aliens, maybe it's artists, maybe it's jokers, maybe it's a new religion, but there is some explanation, right? You might not have the remotest idea of how it got there, but you would hardly doubt that there was an explanation. The idea that it might have come from nothing at all, just popped into existence inexplicably, that it might exist without there being any explanation of its existence, is one that few people would consider worthy of entertaining. This illustrates a metaphysical belief, metaphysical, that seems to be almost a part of reason itself, even though few ever think upon it. The belief, namely, that there is some explanation for the existence of anything, whatever, some reason why it should exist rather than not. That is the principle of sufficient reason. So the status of the principle itself seems to be as a kind of presupposition of rational inquiry. That's the way Leibniz treats it, I think, in the early 18th century or late 17th century. To forswear that principle would be to forswear rationality entirely. Right? And that's not one of the possibilities. Then again, maybe we should forswear rationality entirely, right? I mean, that's not much of a proof that there is an explanation for every single thing. But it's a strong intuitive appeal. Like, we think that there must be an explanation of every possible thing. We tend to presuppose that with regard to specific events and so on. We want to know the explanation. Why did that happen? Okay, like, say, the way we're trying to struggle to explain how the Capitol got ransacked or whatever. Like, what were all the factors? Like, the explanation is incredibly complex in a lot of ways. Trump's rhetoric, social media stuff, the way maybe, militias start operating on social media or something, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then the events that unfolded that day, who came from where. Like, the event is incredibly complex. The explanation, a full-fledged explanation, would be incredibly complex. But we want to know how and why it happened, and we think that in principle it can be explained. And to forswear that to get rid of that would be to get rid of rationality in some profound way, which again does not establish that the PSR is true, or even give you the exact right formulation of it. Right? But here's the basic spirit of the argument. Accept the PSR. All right, let's try this. Do you accept it? Do you accept the principle of sufficient reason? That is, that there is an explanation for anything that may occur or anything that exists? Yes. Okay. Now, the whole needs an explanation, as well as any particular object within the whole. Right? That's the claim. And if that doesn't work out, that's a central premise of the argument. And if that doesn't work out, then the argument does not work out. Okay? The whole, no less than any particular thing within the whole, the existence of the whole, or the coming to be of the whole, requires, the existence of the whole, requires an explanation, no less than that sphere you just found in the woods requires an explanation for its existence and presence. Okay? And the arguments for that he gives are pretty basic and intuitive, right? Like, there might have been no universe. It's a contingent fact that there is anything. A contingent fact. It might possibly have not been the case. It might be the case that there is something, and it might have been the case. It is the case that there is something, but it might have been the case that there is nothing, that there was nothing. That doesn't seem absurd. It just never happened, you know? Now, can we imagine that exactly? I mean, no, actually, maybe not. But it's not absurd. It's not self-contradictory. And then the claim is the universe as a whole is a contingent being, like that sphere you found in the woods. It's something that could exist, you know, that does exist, but could have not existed. It's a, you know, um, it is not itself a necessarily existing thing, because it's not absurd to assert that it doesn't, that it might not have existed. Okay, that it didn't ever arise is not an absurd supposition, although it's false, because there is something rather than nothing. Okay, so we need an explanation by PSR, which we've accepted, let's say, by hypothesis. We need an explanation of the whole. Okay, now, the explanation of the sphere you found in the woods cannot be internal to the sphere. The sphere cannot, it's not an explanation to say it appeared of itself. It spontaneously self-arose or self-created. That's no explanation of anything. You've got to do it in terms of things external to the object that made it happen. What made a boulder? Okay, forces, geological forces, this whole history, you know, they've tumbled down the mountain and lost little bits and or whatever. Okay, that's what made the boulder. But the boulder didn't arise spontaneously from within itself. Okay, and if you said it did, you wouldn't have explained it, right? That's not the form of explanation. So one set of implicit premises in this argument is what constitutes an explanation. I mean, maybe I did insert that in one of the premises here, that, you know, something can only be explained by factors outside itself, which is interesting, also gives you kind of interesting picture of the universe as this place where things are mutually dependent and nothing is entirely independent. Everything is part of a system of causation, let's say, a potential system of explanation when rational agents get involved and try to figure out what the hell's going on. Okay, so we're trying to explain the existence of the whole. So, by the principle we've just enunciated with regard to, say, the sphere, for example, it's got to be something external to the whole that causes the whole. And it can't be an infinite chain of contingent beings, or, you know, an infinite chain of contingently existing universes, because that doesn't provide an explanation. Let's say an infinite chain of causation is possible. Let's say the universe is eternal or whatever. Okay. Maybe that is quite possible. I don't see it as obviously absurd, or at least more argument is needed to show that it's absurd. But if we just explain the existence of some contingent thing in terms of, we can explain the existence of any particular contingent thing in terms of other contingent things that are external to it. But in terms of the existence of all contingent things, that is, the universe, the explanation can only be in terms of a necessary being, or else you have not explained, right, why there is something rather than nothing. That's a important crux of the argument and quite a difficult little bit, I acknowledge. And maybe that's one thing we can focus on Tuesday. It's like, how does he show? And I think the argument is not implausible, actually, that the existence of all contingent beings can only be explained in terms of a necessary being, or else you have not given an adequate explanation, and by hypothesis, we can, okay? So in order to explain the existence of the universe as a whole, we have to appeal to a necessary being, a necessarily existing being, a being whose non-existence is impossible, as what gave rise to that universe, or what explains, or more precisely, what explains the existence and the character of that universe. Now, that gives you a creator God with necessary existence. And that's pretty far toward, the God of the monotheisms, although it doesn't quite give you everything. It doesn't give you omnibenevolence or whatever, right? So, like I say, I've reconstructed this argument more elaborately on this handout, and I'm happy to look at any particular premise in it. Yeah, and then I want to really go on to the arguments by William Rowe against this. And one thing he does is he asks, how good are our reasons actually for believing in the principle of sufficient reason? And so how powerful is an argument that leans on that principle? And he gives some pretty interesting little ways to try to throw it into question. But that's only one of a battery of arguments against this style of thing that we get in Rowe's quite excellent treatment, I think. So we'll. He says. Here's one big spirit of Rowe's objection. If we've explained the existence of every contingent thing in the universe, we're very, very, very far from that. But like if we explained the existence of each contingent thing in terms of other contingent things in the universe, why isn't that an adequate explanation of the whole, or the only possible explanation of the whole? That is, if you explain each thing, such as the sphere in the woods, and the boulder in the woods, and the tree in the woods, and you in the woods, what remains to be explained for the whole? You've explained each thing. Why haven't you explained or done as best you can to explain the whole? Why expect more than that? So, for one thing, maybe the principle of sufficient reason is doubtful in certain ways that he discusses. But another thing is, like, is this a good application of it, where we go like, okay, or let me try this. What would constitute an adequate explanation of the whole? If you adequately explain each part and their relations to one another, all in terms of contingent beings in a network, why wouldn't you have explained the whole? There might be interesting answers to that, though. Okay. Can you answer the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Or maybe Rowe thinks, or maybe this is true, like, that's not the kind of question. Something wrong with that question. It is a bewildering question. All right, more coming soon along these lines, and then we'll be on to Anselm's ontological argument, which is really quite something, man. These are pretty good examples of human ingenuity, even if they don't ultimately succeed. But it's pretty hard to show they don't. I do think that among the arguments we're going to see for the existence of God, a cosmological argument based on the principle of sufficient reason is one of the better ones. It's one of the harder ones to answer if you're trying to refute the existence of refute the arguments for the existence of God, either because you're a fideist and you think having reasons to believe would mess up your faith, or because you're an atheist and you want to deny that God exists and argue that God does not exist. All right. See ya.